name is Dr. Alistair Finch. It is imperative that I state this for the record, not out of vanity, but for the sake of intellectual rigor. A narrator's identity, after all, frames the narrative. I am a historian, an academic whose life's work has been the critical deconstruction of mythologies, specifically those pertaining to the 19th century American West. My forthcoming manuscript, which this unfortunate undertaking was meant to facilitate, is a direct refutation of the romantic, almost hagiographic, historiography that has dominated the field for over a century. I speak, of course, of the Turnerian frontier theory, that simplistic, linear narrative of civilization taming the wilderness, a manifest destiny painted in heroic primary colors. My work seeks to introduce shades of gray, to expose the exploitation, the environmental devastation, and the psychological toll exacted upon those who truly inhabited that so-called empty space. Ironic, then, that I should become a primary source for a history far darker than any I had ever conceived. My descent began with a peculiar advertisement, circulated through a discreet network of university antiquarians and historical societies. A private trust, its benefactors remaining anonymous, sought a winter caretaker for a historically significant and preserved property in the Colorado Rockies. The stipend offered was obscenely generous, enough to fund my department for a year. The primary requirement was a commitment to total isolation from October until the spring thaw. For me, it was not a deterrent, but the principal attraction. An entire winter, free from the endless committee meetings, the sycophantic graduate students, and the incessant hum of digital connectivity. It was the perfect crucible in which to complete my manuscript. A chance to live, in some small measure, the very isolation that shaped the subjects of my research. I accepted the position without hesitation. I viewed the solitude as a tool, a controlled variable in the experiment of my work. I was, as always, a scholar in command of his subject. The journey to the cabin was a lesson in vertical geography, a deliberate shedding of the modern world. My guide, a man named Elias, whose vocabulary seemed to consist entirely of grunts and terse nods, drove me from a small, forgettable town into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. As the truck climbed, the very character of the land transformed. We entered the montane zone, a world of stately ponderosa pines and Douglas firs that stood like sentinels on the slopes. The air, still thick enough to breathe without thought, carried the sweet, resinous scent of pine, a smell I'd read could be reminiscent of butterscotch or vanilla when the bark was warmed by the sun. We passed a small herd of mule deer, their liquid eyes watching our mechanical intrusion with placid indifference. The sharp, scolding cry of a Steller's jay cut through the engine's drone, a flash of defiant blue against the green and brown. Then, we climbed higher. The broad-shouldered ponderosas gave way to the slender, steeple-like forms of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. The road narrowed, becoming little more than a dirt track clinging to the mountainside. The world grew quieter, the vibrant life of the lower elevations replaced by a more severe and solemn beauty. The air thinned, and I noted the first subtle signs of physiological protest, a faint pressure behind the eyes, a whisper of light-headedness. I dismissed it as a matter of course, the body's predictable complaint against the sudden lack of oxygen, a simple case for acclimatization. The sense of isolation, however, was no mere physiological symptom. It was a palpable presence, a weight in the air. The silence was no longer an absence of noise, but a sound in itself, broken only by the mournful howl of wind whipping through the high peaks. Elias stopped the truck in a small, sheltered clearing. Before us stood the cabin. It was not the charming, rustic fantasy of lifestyle magazines. It was a genuine artifact, a relic of the 19th century, likely the home of a forgotten prospector or trapper. Hewn logs, dark with age and weather, formed the walls, chinked with a substance that looked like dried mud and moss. A crude stone chimney stood sentinel at one end. The structure was flanked by a dense, almost claustrophobic stand of subalpine fir and gnarled, ancient limber pines, their branches twisted into tormented shapes by centuries of wind. It was a place built not for comfort, but for survival. The interior confirmed this impression. It was a single, Spartan room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its maw black with soot. A rough, hewn table and a single chair stood in the center. A simple bunk was built into the far wall. Nailed to the logs was a dry goods box, serving as a makeshift cupboard, just as the historical accounts described. There was no electricity, no plumbing. My only light would come from a supply of oil lamps, my only heat from a formidable stack of firewood on the porch. Elias deposited my pack, pointed to the rations, a series of nondescript, vacuum-sealed bags, and then, with a final, unreadable glance, he left. The sound of his truck's engine faded, swallowed by the immense silence, and I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. It was on the table that I found it. Not a friendly note of welcome, but a single sheet of paper, laminated, as if to withstand the ravages of time and frantic hands. It was titled, in a stark, block typeface, "The Caretaker's Memorandum." It was a list of rules. My first reaction was one of academic amusement. It was a perfect piece of folklore, a primary document of the anxieties of isolation, perhaps the product of a previous caretaker's miner's madness, a term for the delusions brought on by solitude and hardship. I read it with the detached curiosity of a historian examining an artifact. 1. On arrival, do not bring any personal food items into the cabin. Rations are provided. Dispose of all packaging from your journey in the incinerator before dusk on the first day. 2. Doors and windows. The main door must be bolted from the inside between sunset and sunrise. Never cover the small, circular window on the north-facing wall. 3. The fireplace must never be allowed to go out completely. If the flames burn blue, add a sprig of the dried rowan bundle kept on the mantel. Do not ask why. 4. Sounds, you will hear sounds. The wind has a voice in these mountains. The trees groan. The picas squeaks. Learn to distinguish these from other sounds. 5. The picas call. If you hear a single, sharp eep from directly beneath the floorboards after midnight, do not move from your bunk until you hear it a second time. If a second call does not come within 1 minute, the first was not a pica. 6. The Clark's nutcracker. These birds are clever and remember much. Do not let them see you writing. If one lands on the porch railing and squawks 3 times, you have been observed. Burn the page you were writing and do not resume your work until the next day. 7. The scent of pine. The scent of pine is clean. The scent of rot is not. If you smell rot inside the cabin, the fireplace is your friend. See Rule 3. 8. The north window. You may feel compelled to look through the north window at night. This is normal. If you see a pair of eyes looking back, they are only a reflection of the lamps. Convince yourself of this. 9. The knocking. There is no one else for 50 miles. If you hear a knock on the door, it is the wind. If you hear a knock on the inside of the door, check that it is still bolted. 10. The predecessor. Do not search for any records left by previous caretakers. Their experiences are not relevant to your own. Their contract is concluded. I chuckled as I finished the list. It was a masterwork of psychological suggestion, a script for self-induced paranoia. The rules escalated so perfectly from the seemingly practical's Rule 1 done to the bizarrely specific as Rule 5A and the overtly supernatural Rule 9. It was a game, and I decided, for the sake of the experience, to play along. I dutifully incinerated my wrappers, bolted the door as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, and built a steady fire in the hearth. As night fell, the true weight of the wilderness settled. The headache that had been a dull throb was now a persistent, pounding ache, a classic symptom of high-altitude exposure. The silence in the cabin was so absolute it felt like a pressure on my eardrums. I tried to work on my manuscript, but the words swam before my eyes. I was a scholar of the West, but for the first time, I was feeling its physical reality, the thin air, the crushing emptiness. I retired to the bunk, the rough wool of the blanket scratching at my skin. Sleep would not come. I lay in the flickering lamplight, listening to the groan of the cabin timbers and the ceaseless sigh of the wind, and then I heard it. Eep. A single, sharp, piercing note from directly beneath the floorboards. It was the unmistakable call of a pika, the small, rock-dwelling lagomorph I'd read about. My breath caught in my throat. My heart, which had been beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs, suddenly hammered. Rule 5. If you hear a single sharp "ip," do not move from your bunk until you hear it a second time. My rational mind screamed at me. It's an animal. The house is old. Sound travels in strange ways. It's a coincidence. But my body did not listen to my rational mind. It listened to the rule. I lay perfectly still, a statue carved from fear, my eyes wide in the gloom. I counted the seconds, the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears. 1, 2, 3, 30, 59, and 60. No second call came. A tremor ran through me, a cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I told myself it was the wind, a branch scraping against the foundation, the house settling. I repeated these rationalizations like a mantra, a prayer to the god of logic I had always worshipped, but the seed of a different kind of belief, a primal, superstitious fear, had been planted in the fertile soil of my isolation. I finally reached for my journal, my hand unsteady. I wrote, "The psychological effects of high altitude exposure and prolonged environmental confinement are proving more potent than the literature suggests. One must remain vigilant against the mind's tendency to create patterns from chaos." But as I wrote the words, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was lying to myself. The first was not a pika, and I had a long, long winter ahead. The first week was a study in self-deception. I dedicated myself to my manuscript with a ferocious, almost punitive, discipline. I treated the incident with the pika as a data point, an initial, predictable psychological tremor caused by the confluence of altitude, isolation, and suggestion. In my journal, I wrote lengthy, dispassionate analysis of cabin fever, citing historical accounts of prospectors succumbing to delusions in the vast, silent emptiness of the frontier. I was not, I assured myself, one of them. I was a scholar, an observer. The cabin and its absurd list of rules were my subject, not my reality. My reality was the rigorous, evidence-based world of historical analysis, a world built on footnotes and peer-reviewed certainty. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity: chop wood, tend the fire, melt snow for water, prepare the bland but nourishing rations. The silence became a familiar blanket, and the persistent headache from the thin air subsided to a dull, manageable pressure. I was acclimatizing, both physically and mentally. The fear from that first night felt distant, a foolish overreaction. I was beginning to feel in command again. It was during a particularly productive afternoon, while I was drafting a chapter dismantling the heroic myth of the lone frontiersman. that Rule 6 came into play. I was writing at the rough, hewn table, the cabin filled with the clean, sharp scent of the surrounding pines, a smell I had come to associate with clarity and focus. My pen moved swiftly across the page, my argument flowing with an ease that had eluded me back at the university. I was dissecting the very notion of the wilderness as a passive entity, arguing instead that it was an active, often hostile, force that shaped and broke the men who entered it. Then, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. On the porch railing, a bird had landed. It was a Clark's notecracker, its plumage a handsome charcoal gray with flashes of black and white on its wings and tail. I had seen them before, flitting through the high branches, their calls a series of harsh, grating squawks that echoed through the trees. This one, however, was different. It was perfectly still, its head cocked, its intelligent, dark eye fixed directly on me. Cra! A single, rasping call. I paused, my pen hovering over the paper. Cra! A second call, identical to the first. I felt a prickle of unease, the memory of the laminated list surfacing from the intellectual fortress I had constructed around myself. Rule 6C. These birds are clever and remember much. Do not let them see you writing. Cra. The third squawk was sharp, definitive. It felt less like a bird call and more like an indictment. My heart began to beat a little faster. If one lands on the porch, railing and squawks 3 times, you have been observed. Burn the page you were writing and do not resume your work until the next day. I stared at the bird. It stared back, unblinking. This was absurd. It was a corvid, a family of birds known for their intelligence and mimicry. It was a coincidence. To burn a full page of good work that was finally flowing, because of a bird's random vocalizations. It was an affront to reason, a surrender to the very primitive superstition I was dedicating my life to deconstructing. Preposterous, I muttered, and deliberately turned back to my page, pressing my pen to the paper with defiant force. The bird let out a fourth, ear-splitting shriek. At the exact same moment, the oil lamp on my table, its flame previously burning with a steady, placid glow, flared violently. A tongue of greasy, black smoke erupted from the chimney, and the glass cracked with a sharp ping. The cabin was plunged into the dim, gray light of the late afternoon. I froze, my hand trembling. The smell of burnt wick and hot oil filled my nostrils. Outside, the nutcracker was gone. I sat in the sudden gloom, the silence pressing in on me once more. But this time it was not empty. It was charged, expectant. My carefully constructed rationalizations crumbled like sun-baked mud. I looked at the page in front of me, the words now seeming like a foolish provocation. With a shaking hand, I tore it from my notebook, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it into the fireplace. It caught immediately, the ink of my academic arguments turning to black ash before being consumed by the orange flames. I did not write again that day. The next few days were a slow descent into a new kind of anxiety. My work, once a refuge, now felt fraught with peril. I found myself writing in short, furtive bursts, constantly glancing towards the window, my ears straining for the sound of a squawking bird. My academic integrity, the very core of my identity, felt compromised, held hostage by a set of irrational rules. It was then that the smell began. It started subtly, a faint, unpleasant undertone beneath the dominant scent of pine and wood smoke. I first dismissed it as a trick of the mind, my senses perhaps dulled or distorted by the altitude. But it grew stronger, a cloying, sickly, sweet odor of decay. It was the smell of rot, of something damp and spoiled. I searched the cabin meticulously, my scientific mind desperate for a logical source. I checked the vacuum-sealed rations, finding them all intact. I swept the floor, peered under the bunk, and even ventured into the crawl space, my lamp casting flickering shadows on the cold, dark earth. I found nothing. No dead animal, no patch of mold, nothing. Yet the smell persisted, growing thicker, more invasive. It clung to the blankets, seeped into my clothes, and tainted the very air I breathed. It was worst at night, a phantom presence in the darkness that made sleep nearly impossible. My journal entries from this period became increasingly erratic. The olfactory hallucination continues. I wrote one night, the formal language a thin shield against a rising panic, likely a symptom of hypoxia, induced cognitive impairment, must remain objective. But objectivity was slipping through my fingers like fine sand. The smell became a form of torture. It was a constant reminder of Rule 70, the scent of pine is clean. The scent of rot is not. If you smell rot inside the cabin, the fireplace is your friend. See Rule 3. And Rule 3 stated, the fireplace must never be allowed to go out completely. If the flames burn blue, add a sprig of the dried rowan bundle kept on the mantel. For days, I resisted. Using a sprig of dried plant to combat a smell felt like a regression. A step into the pre-scientific world of sympathetic magic and folk remedies I'd read about in Fraser's work. A world of ritual and taboo that had no place in my empirical reality. But the stench was becoming unbearable, a physical weight in the cabin. Finally, broken and desperate, I gave in. On the mantel, above the hearth, sat a small, brittle bundle of twigs and withered red berries, tied with a piece of twine. It was the rowan. My hand shook as I took a single sprig. The fire was burning low, its embers glowing a deep, angry red. As I watched, a section of the flame flickered and changed, shifting from orange to a soft, ethereal blue, just as the rule had predicted. A cold dread washed over me. Taking a deep breath, I tossed the rowan sprig into the blue part of the flame. It did not burn like normal wood. It vanished in a silent, brilliant flash of white light, leaving no ash. And in that instant, the smell of rot was gone. Completely. The air in the cabin was once again clean, filled only with the scent of pine and burning spruce. I sank into the chair, my body trembling with a mixture of relief and profound terror. I had followed the rule, and it had worked. The world I knew, a world governed by physics and logic, no longer seemed to apply within these four walls. I was in a place where folklore was law. That night, I found myself drawn to the north window. Rule 8. You may feel compelled to look through the north window at night. This is normal. The compulsion was a physical pull, a magnetic urge I could not resist. I had avoided that small, circular pane of glass since my arrival, but now it was the only thing in the cabin that mattered. I stood before it, the lamplight behind me casting my own faint reflection on the cold glass. I stared out into the impenetrable blackness of the subalpine night, and something stared back. 2 points of light, low to the ground, gleaming in the darkness. They were not the bright, reflective green of a deer or a cougar caught in a beam of light. They were a dull, self-contained yellow like the embers of a dying fire. They were eyes. If you see a pair of eyes looking back, they are only a reflection of the lamps. Convince yourself of this. I tried. I squeezed my own eyes shut, telling myself it was a trick of the light, my own reflection, distorted by the imperfect glass and the darkness, a psychological projection. I opened them again. The eyes were still there, unblinking, watching. I could not convince myself of anything other than the raw, primal fact that I was being observed by something in the night. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart hammering against my ribs. I scrambled to the main door, my hands fumbling for the heavy iron bolt. It was solid, secure. I was locked in, or was something locked in with me? That's when I heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the groan of the logs. It was a sound that had no right to exist. Knock. 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 It was sharp, deliberate, and clear. And it was not coming from the outside of the door. It was coming from the inside. My world, once a meticulously ordered library of facts and citations, collapsed into a single, echoing point of terror. The 3 solid knocks that had emanated from the inside of the door. My first coherent thought was not academic, not analytical, but a primal, animal scream that died in my throat. I scrambled backward, away from the door, my back hitting the rough, hewn logs of the opposite wall, with a force that knocked the wind from my lungs. My eyes were locked on the heavy iron bolt. It was still in place, a dark, solid line against the weathered wood, unmoved, unviolated. The silence that followed was worse than the knocking itself. It was a thinking silence, a listening silence. I was trapped in a shoebox with something that didn't obey the laws of physics. Something that could wrap its knuckles on the inside of a sealed exit. My mind, the tool I had honed my entire life, was now a liability, a frantic machine cycling through impossible explanations. A prank. Elias, my grim-faced guide, returning to torment me. Impossible. The sound of his truck would have announced his approach for miles. A complex auditory hallucination, brought on by a cocktail of altitude, isolation, and stress. This was my last bastion of rationalism, the explanation I clung to like a drowning man to a splinter of wood. But my body knew better. The cold sweat, the frantic hammering of my heart, the tremor in my hands. These were not the symptoms of a man observing a psychological curiosity. They were the responses of prey. For 2 days, I existed in a state of vigilant paralysis. I tended the fire, ate the tasteless rations, and melted snow, but my movements were stiff, robotic. I abandoned my manuscript. The intellectual arrogance of my thesis, dissecting the myths of the West, now seemed like a grotesque joke. I was living a myth far more potent and terrifying than any I had ever studied. My journal entries changed. The detached, clinical tone vanished, replaced by the frantic scrawl of a man documenting his own unraveling. The acoustic anomaly has not repeated. I wrote, my hand shaking so badly the words were barely legible. The silence is absolute. I cannot distinguish between the absence of sound and the presence of something listening. My own thoughts feel alien, intrusive. Am I the subject or the observer? It was during the second sleepless night, after the knocking, that my obsession with Rule 10 began. Do not search for any records left by previous caretakers. Their experiences are not relevant to your own. Their contract is concluded. Before, it had seemed like a practical, if slightly ominous, piece of advice. Now, it was a challenge, a taunt. My entire career was built on the foundation of primary sources, on the belief that the experiences of predecessors were not only relevant but essential. To understand the present, one must excavate the past. The rule was anathema to my very being as a historian. A new, desperate logic took hold. The rules were a system. I had followed them, and they had, in their own terrifying way, worked. The Rowan sprig had banished the rot. Burning my manuscript page had seemingly appeased the nutcracker. Perhaps understanding the experiences of my predecessor was the key to surviving my own. The prohibition was a test, a final, crucial piece of the puzzle that I was meant to solve. This rationalization was thin, a desperate attempt to frame my growing terror as an intellectual pursuit, but it was enough. I had to know. I had to find what they had left. The search began the next morning. I violated the sanctity of the historical artifact I was meant to preserve, my actions a frantic desecration. I ran my hands over every log, searching for loose chinking. I tapped every floorboard, listening for a hollow sound. I dismantled the crude bunk, peered up the soot-blackened chimney, and sifted through the cold ashes in the hearth. Nothing. The cabin was brutally, maddeningly simple. A box for living with no space for secrets. Hours passed. My initial, methodical search devolved into a frenzy. I was no longer a scholar. I was a grave robber, tearing at the bones of the past. Finally, in the late afternoon, my fingers, raw and splintered, found it. Near the hearth, one of the wide floorboards felt slightly loose. Using the tip of my hunting knife, I pried at the edge. It resisted, then gave way with a low groan. I lifted it, my heart pounding against my ribs. There was nothing there but the dark, cold earth of the foundation. My hope collapsed into a well of despair. I had been wrong. It was all in my head. I was just another case study in miner's madness. A man driven insane by the whispering silence of the mountains. I was about to replace the board when my lamplight caught a faint irregularity on its underside. I turned it over. It was not a journal. It was not a letter. It was a series of words, gouged into the wood with what must have been a nail or a sharp stone. The script was crude, almost childish, the desperate markings of a mind under siege. Not of rufletima and itmar sthr dot locadrs. I read the words once, twice, a third time. The blood drained from my face, a cold wave washing over me. This was not a solution. It was a confirmation of a reality far worse than I had imagined. The rules were not a guide to understanding separate phenomena. They were a list of misdirections. The wind, the pica, the reflection, they were all lies, masks worn by a single protein entity. It wasn't that there were many things to fear in these mountains. It was that there was one thing that could be. Anything. It wears their faces. The Clark's nutcracker, its intelligent eye fixed on me. The yellow eyes in the dark. The pica's call from a place a pica would never be. They were all at probbing. Testing. Mimicking the life of the mountain to hide its own alien wrongness. Don't look at yours. My gaze shot to the dark. Circular window on the north wall. My reflection. Rule 8 had told me to convince myself the eyes were only a reflection of the lamps. But what if the rule was a trap? What if looking at my own reflection in that glass was an invitation? A way for it to learn my face, to wear it. I stumbled away from the window, my breath catching in my throat. I felt a sudden, suffocating claustrophobia. The walls of the cabin, the very logs themselves, seemed to press in on me. My eyes darted around the small space, seeing everything anew. The rough-hewn table, the single chair, the dry goods box on the wall. Were they just objects? Or were they waiting too? Then I heard a new sound. It was not a knock. It was not a squeak. It was a soft, wet, dragging noise. A sound of friction. Of something thick and heavy being pulled across wood. It was coming from the wall next to me. From inside one of the massive, ancient logs that formed the cabin structure. My academic mind was a distant memory, a ghost of a former self. All that remained was instinct. I pressed my ear against the cold, rough bark of the log. The dragging sound was louder now, closer, and beneath it, I could hear something else, a whisper. It was faint, distorted, like a voice heard through water. But it was unmistakable. It was my own voice, and it was pleading from inside the wood. "Please," it whispered. "Let me out." The voice in the wood was my own. It was not a memory, not an echo. It was a present, pleading thing, muffled by cellulose and time. My academic mind, the last flickering ember of the man I had been, tried to categorize it: auditory pareidolia, stress, induced hallucination. the neurological decay of high-altitude cerebral edema. But the historian in me, the part that had just read the desperate carving of my predecessor, knew better. This was not a symptom. It was a communication. The entity was wearing my voice, just as it had worn the face of a pica and the eyes in the dark. I recoiled from the log wall, a chattering, animal fear overriding all higher thought. The plea came again, more insistent. "It's so dark in here. Please, Alistair, let me out." My name, spoken in my own cadence, from a place where no mouth could be. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the sound was inside my head, a perfect mimicry of my own internal monologue. The predecessor's warning became my new, terrible creed. Ok eturs, my reflection. The last face it hadn't yet worn. I became a man terrified of surfaces. I threw a blanket over the north window, a direct violation of Rule 2. But the fear of seeing my own face looking back with those yellow eyes was a far more immediate threat. I stopped looking into the water bucket, scooping out what I needed with my eyes averted. Drinking from a tin cup, I never allowed to be more than half full. I was a scholar of the Enlightenment, a debunker of myths, now living by the arcane logic of taboo. The psychological siege intensified. The entity was no longer testing the rules, it was rewriting them. The knocking returned, but now it was a frantic, rolling thunder that seemed to come from all four walls at once, as if the entire cabin were a drum being beaten by 1,000 fists. The scent of rot seeped back into the air, thick and suffocating, but when I scrambled to the mantel, the roll-on bundle was gone. The fire, my only companion, my only source of heat and light, began to burn with a sickly, guttering flame, no matter how much wood I fed it. Rule 3, the fireplace must never be allowed to go out completely, became the central focus of my existence. It was my last defense. Then the blizzard came. It descended without warning, a solid wall of white that erased the world. The wind shrieked, a constant, high, pitched keen that swallowed all other sound. I was no longer in a cabin in the mountains. I was in a box adrift in a sea of roaring chaos, and the entity used that chaos. Through the howl of the storm, I heard the distinct, grinding rumble of a truck engine. Elias, he had come back. A wave of impossible relief washed over me, so potent it brought tears to my eyes. I rushed to the door, my hand reaching for the bolt before I froze. There was no one else for 50 miles. It was a trick, a lie woven from sound and desperation. I backed away from the door, my heart a cold stone in my chest. "Help!" The voice that cut through the wind was my own. "I'm out here! I'm freezing!" I squeezed my eyes shut. It was a phantom, a lure. But the part of me that was still human, still capable of empathy, screamed to open the door. I was at war with myself. My own compassion had been weaponized against me. That's when I saw him. Through a small gap in the blanket covering the north window, I saw a figure standing in the swirling snow. It was me, Dr. Alistair Finch, dressed in my own tweed jacket, my own worn boots. He stood perfectly still, his head cocked with a familiar, analytical curiosity. He looked calm, he looked rational, and his eyes, glowing with a faint, internal luminescence, were the color of old sulfur. I stumbled back, a strangled cry escaping my lips. The knocking stopped. The wind seemed to die down. The cabin fell into a profound and terrifying silence. I stood in the center of the room, trembling, my gaze locked on the door, expecting it to burst open. But the horror did not come from without. It was already within. I heard the soft scratch of a pen on paper behind me. I turned slowly, my muscles screaming in protest. There, at my table, sat another Alistair Finch. My double. It was wearing my clothes, sitting in my chair, holding my pen. and it was writing in my journal, its hand moving with a calm, academic confidence. It looked up at me, a faint, condescending smile on its lips, my lips. The psychological effects of high altitude exposure and prolonged environmental confinement, it said, its voice a perfect, resonant copy of my own, her proving more potent than the literature suggests. One must remain vigilant against the mind's tendency to create patterns from chaos. It was quoting me. My first journal entry. My first pathetic attempt to rationalize the terror of this place. The entity had not just worn the faces of the mountain's creatures. It had studied me, learned me, and now it was wearing the face of my intellect, my skepticism, my very identity. It was the ultimate act of plagiarism. Something inside me broke, not with fear, but with a white, hot, intellectual rage. This thing, this monstrous, mocking parasite, was not just trying to kill me. It was trying to erase me, to replace my history with its own grotesque parody. My life's work, my manuscript, lay on the table next to it, the very reason I had come to this godforsaken place. It was my history, my legacy, and the creature was about to claim it. In that moment, I understood. The only way to win was not to play by the rules, but to burn the entire game board. With a scream that was pure fury, I lunged past the doppelganger, not at it, but at the hearth. I grabbed a burning log from the dying fire, the searing heat a distant, unimportant fact. I turned, not to the creature, but to the neat stack of papers on the table. My manuscript. My refutation of the romantic myths of the West. My contract is concluded. I roared, the words of Rule 10 now a declaration of war. I thrust the burning log into the heart of my life's work. The pages, filled with a decade of research and carefully crafted arguments, curled, blackened, and burst into flame. The creature, the thing wearing my face, rose from the chair. The calm, academic expression dissolved into a mask of contorted agony. It opened its mouth and shrieked, but the sound was not my voice. It was a symphony of every terror. I had endured the pika's squeak, the nutcracker's squawk, the knocking, the wind, all layered into one impossible, soul-shredding sound. The cabin became an inferno. The flames devoured my manuscript, then leaped to the table, to the walls, to the very logs that had whispered my name. The doppelganger anger dissolved, melting back into the smoke and shadows from which it had been born. I stumbled through the fire and out the door, collapsing into the snow of the now silent blizzard, the world behind me a roaring pyre of burning history.